Recently, Representative Ilhan Omar got in a little bit of trouble for asking some actually pretty poignant questions about war crimes. All right, now, as you're going to see in the video, what she asked U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, she's gonna ask him if there are any mechanisms for justice of victims of war crimes that are outside the jurisdictions of the International Criminal Court. So I'm going to show you that video and then we're going to break it down.
I know you opposed the court's investigation in both Palestine and in Afghanistan. I haven't seen any evidence in either cases that domestic courts both can and will prosecute alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity. And I would emphasize that in Israel and Palestine, this includes crimes committed by both the Israeli security forces and Hamas. In Afghanistan, it includes crimes committed by the Afghan national government and the Taliban. So in both of these cases, if domestic courts can't or won't pursue justice, and we oppose the ICC, where do we think the victims of these supposed crimes can go for justice? In both of these cases, if domestic courts can't or won't pursue justice, and we oppose the ICC, where do we think victims are supposed to go for justice? And what justice mechanisms do you support for them?
All right, so look, that's a question. That's a good question. How anybody can go and take that and flip out, I don't know why. But again, it's a fair question. It's a good question. But apparently it's also an uncomfortable question because it turns out that we are the ones, we are one of many state actors that have and are doing war crimes. So obviously pretty uncomfortable for the United States, who has done war crimes. Again, and let me just point out some of them. Illegal invasions, for example, Iraq. Killing civilians, as evidenced by Chelsea Manning. You also have the spying on American citizens, once again revealed by Edward Snowden. You also have, reports that we use depleted uranium weapons or rounds in the Middle East. We've done regime change wars, proxy wars, and a lot of people either don't know this or they don't want to admit that sometimes we're the baddies. Our government has done things that are bad that we as people, as citizens of this country, shouldn't be proud of. So now this is important because the United States, and this goes all the way back to Bill Clinton, who decided, not to get involved, not to support the International Criminal Court, during his presidency, and we haven't supported it since. That was, of course, the creation of that. And not only that, but interestingly enough, we've actually supported, the United States has supported the actions of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, while not being a part of them. And we did up until, by the way, they started looking into war crimes in Afghanistan perpetrated by the U.S. forces, and of course, Israel and their alleged war crimes happening in the Palestinian territories. And so now I go back to the Rome Statute. And so the Rome Statute is basically where a lot of countries that signed on to legitimize the power of the International Criminal Court, that was what gave them their legitimacy to go after criminals across the globe. The U.S. and Israel have not signed that agreement, Now, of course, there are non-state actors that have signed it as well, which are, the Taliban, of course, and Hamas. So now the Taliban and Hamas, they've done horrible things too, bombing civilians, suicide bombings, human rights abuses, of course. And well, guess what? We've also done that. And the Israeli right-wing government has also done that. And so what Ilhan Omar is basically calling for is recognition that basically war crimes bad, and that victims of war crimes in places where the ICC is not recognized have to have some sort of vehicle for justice to get justice. And right now they don't have that. And so what can we do to actually make sure that they have a vehicle to get justice if they're the victims of war crimes? Now, I think that's a totally fair question. I think it's an open question, okay? Or not an open question, but it's a totally fair question, totally honest question. And I think it opens up a good conversation. So now, unfortunately, a lot of Democratic colleagues took some umbrage with that. Now, Omar first came under fire from Democratic lawmakers on Wednesday when a dozen moderate representatives issued a statement accusing her of equating the U.S. and Israel to Hamas and the Taliban. Now, again, you've seen her statement. You saw her question. Was there equivocation there? Not that I could see. And also, they accused her of displaying a deep-seated prejudice and giving cover to terrorist groups. Yikes. Later Thursday, the entire House Democratic leadership, including Nancy Pelosi, also issued a statement, quote, drawing false equivalencies between democracies like the U.S., we're a representative republic, and Israel. I don't really believe that you can be a good model for democracy if you're an apartheid state. But saying that drawing that false equivalency between those democracies and groups that engage in terrorism like Hamas and Taliban foments prejudice and undermines progress toward a future of peace and security for all. What about the peace and security for Palestinians, for the Afghan people? What about justice, more importantly? And by the way, if you actually have peace and security for Palestinian people, stopping the illegal settlements, well, guess what? That also helps guarantee the safety and security of people in Israel, since Hamas would no longer have the support or backing of many of the people in the Palestinian territories to go and fire rockets. Okay? Again, all of this is methods of last resort, and understand that terrorism generally tends to be a result of being crushed in some way, being, and I can't think of the word, oppressed in some way. People tend to lash out. That's not always the case, of course. But I think in this case, that response there by certain groups, it's not a good response. And don't get me wrong, I don't support that response. I don't support firing rockets. It's ridiculous and stupid. But I'm just saying that I can understand that that's a cause of that is that deep-seated oppression. And so there's that. Anyway, so now, again, she's not saying that America is just like Hamas. Again, all she's doing is asking for, hey, what do we do for victims of war crimes perpetrated by countries outside the ICC? And just because we're not part of the ICC doesn't mean that we should be able to get away with doing bad things like war crimes. However, apparently, accountability is a bridge too far. Party leaders added that they welcome clarification by Omar that there is no moral equivalency between the U.S. and Israel and Hamas and the Taliban. So now they asked for clarification. Here's what she said. Quote, on Monday, I asked Secretary of State Blinken about ongoing International Criminal Court investigations. To be clear, the conversation was about accountability for specific instances regarding those ICC cases, not a moral comparison between Hamas and the Taliban and the U.S. and Israel. I was in no way equating terrorist organizations with democratic countries with well-established judicial systems. True. Omar later noted that victims, quote, don't trust the well-established judicial systems of Israel and the U.S. to deliver justice. And those of you who might be wondering why. Well, here's an example. Treatment of indigenous people in this country. Not a lot of justice for them. The profile of Muslims in America following 9/11. Not really a lot of justice for them as well. Doing surveillance, following them around mosques. You can go back a lot of different examples, right? The same thing happened to the Japanese during World War II. This is our government. This is our system that allowed for those systems to happen, allowed for these atrocities. More recently, Guantanamo Bay, where there were innocent people that were held and tortured there. One example is Murad Murat Kurnaz, who was held in extrajudicial detention by the U.S., first in Afghanistan and then in Guantanamo Bay. And that was the beginning of December of 2001. He was, by the way, tortured in both places. By early of 2002, intelligence officials of the United States and Germany had both concluded the accusations against Kurnaz were groundless, and yet he was held there for an additional 4 years. So, yeah, that's a crime. That is a crime. And it was involved in the so-called war on terror. Now, what's interesting here is, again, I mentioned that we're not part of the ICC, but we have helped them in the past, taken action against regimes and people under investigation, by the ICC. However, again, only until they started looking at the U.S. government and the Israeli government did the ICC suddenly become a problem. And right now, the investigations here is an investigation into American military actions in Afghanistan between the years of 2003 and 2004. Dozens of people had claimed to have been tortured during interrogations by the CIA in black sites created by the Bush administration. Again, war crimes. 2 current Guantanamo detainees, Sharkawi Al-Hajj and Gula Duran, who were represented by legal counsel, have provided detailed testimony to the ICC to that effect, that they were indeed tortured. Another, again, is the ICC's investigation into possible crimes by Israel related to Jewish settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Again, that's what started the recent exchange of fire between Hamas and the IDF. Is those evictions in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. And so, look, they don't like those investigations. They're not in favor of these investigations. And look, again, right now, the U.S. government, even under Joe Biden and under, Benjamin Netanyahu and whoever's going to replace him, are both far right. And as such, we don't really like being held accountable. In fact, during the Trump administration, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo had warned that the ICC would, quote, end its illegitimate probe into the U.S. or else face consequences. So that seems to be a direct threat. Sadly, again, the Biden administration is essentially doing the same thing, not really helping at all, and saying, you should probably stop investigating us and our friends in Israel. And now the Democratic Party is unfortunately targeting Ilhan Omar, which most certainly helps the right wing, also endangering Ilhan Omar's life. She already gets enough death threats as it is. In fact, Omar spokesperson Jeremy Slevin earlier on Thursday accused him of ginning up the same Islamophobic hate against her, which would be the far right. And you also had Omar that tweeted, quote, we serve in Congress with Islamophobes like Representative Mo Brooks, and Democratic colleagues will not condemn him and instead give him legitimacy to his dangerous rhetoric. And that rhetoric, of course, and I'm gonna read something that Mo Brooks had said, quote, Muslims, more so than most people, have great animosity towards Israel and the Jewish faith. As you have more and more Muslims in the U.S., as they gain greater and greater influence in elections, you're going to see more people like Ilhan Omar. So that is deeply Islamophobic. Again, there's 6 billion Muslims. If they wanted us all dead, we'd kind of be dead at this point. And by the way, I love how much projection this is, because Mo Brooks and members of the far right have allied with deeply anti-Semitic people. Members of the far right are the ones who chanted, the Jews will not replace us. It's pretty ridiculous to think that those people are on the side of the Jewish people, as opposed to people who want peace in both Israel and Palestine. And look, again, there is a reason that the far right defends Israel. For one, again, the far right, what they want to do, first they want to get rid of Jewish people in America by sending them all to Israel. And other members of the far right, the evangelicals, think that once the Jews get there, then Jesus is going to kick off the end times, which is what they're all waiting for. They're all waiting for. So these are deeply anti-Semitic positions, and yet the Democrats are right now so afraid of criticizing Israel because then they get called anti-Semitic by the right wing that they attack Ilhan Omar and they defend the right-wing government of Israel, who's making things worse by doing illegal things and essentially operating the world's largest open-air prison. So now, she was attacked, but people did rise to her defense. The Congressional Progressive Caucus issued this statement saying that her voice is critical and necessary. Quote, "We cannot ignore a right-wing media echo chamber that has deliberately and routinely attacked a black Muslim woman in Congress, distorting her views and intentions and resulting in threats against her and her staff. We urge our colleagues not to abet or amplify such divisive and bad faith tactics." More. Omar said on Wednesday, by the way, that she was once again enduring threats against her life, saying that every time I speak out on human rights, I'm inundated with death threats, which led, of course, to more progressives backing her, beginning with Cori Bush and Ayanna Pressley, who attacked the bad faith attempts, to take Omar's words out of context. She said, imagine if Congress was as outraged by what Palestinians endured daily. Representative Jamal Bowman also chimed in, urging fellow Democrats to recognize the biases that fuel personal attacks and defend our colleagues. When a woman, person of color, or Muslim speaks out against injustice, backlash ensues. When Omar speaks out, the vitriol is compounded by her being all three. True. Rashida Tlaib, the first Palestinian-American woman elected to Congress, tweeted that freedom of speech doesn't exist for Muslim women in Congress. The benefit of the doubt doesn't exist for Muslim women in Congress either. House Democratic leadership should be ashamed of its relentless exclusive tone policing of Congresswomen of color. And here you have, interestingly enough, this is somebody who's not exactly known as a progressive, right, when it comes to policy positions. But Representative Betty McCollum also had an amazing statement on this. Here's what she said. When state actors, including democracies or non-state actors such as terrorist organizations, engage in acts to indiscriminately kill civilians or commit gross violations of human rights, such as torture, which we've done, indefinite detention, there should be internationally recognized mechanisms to achieve accountability and enforce agreed upon humanitarian standards. Representative Omar asked a serious question, which is her right as a member of Congress, but the hypocrites of the NRCC, that's Republicans, should be reminded of their silence when the Trump administration sat down with the Taliban to negotiate a diplomatic agreement without the Afghan government, while American service members and Afghan civilians were being attacked and killed. Anti-war activists and human rights defenders went much further than members of the U.S. government, which has killed more foreign civilians by far than any other entity of the world since waging the only nuclear war in history in 1945. Since then, millions of men, women, and children have died in U.S.-led wars, bombings, and covert actions in dozens of countries on every inhabited continent, including at least hundreds of thousands and perhaps well over 1 million during the nearly 20-year war on terror. God damn! Look, Benny McCollum, on that, based. On other things, not so much. But wow. AOC also stuck up for, of course, Ilhan Omar. And there's more. Code Pink National Co-Director Ariel Gold said this. Actually, the U.S. has likely committed worse atrocities than the Taliban and Hamas combined. Remember the Iraq War, Abu Ghraib, referring, of course, to numerous prisons, black sites, Guantanamo Bay. Prisoners in the war on terror were tortured, sometimes to death, by U.S. military and intelligence personnel. These men and women were informed by techniques described in U.S. torture manuals used to instruct security forces from Latin American and other dictatorships that the U.S. Army schooled of the Americas and other torture training centers. By the way, in the decades since the end of World War II, the U.S. has also supported regimes that perpetrated genocidal mass murder in Indonesia, West Papua, Bangladesh, Guatemala, East Timor, Kurdistan, and Iraq, as well as Israeli ethnic cleansing, apartheid, colonization, and other crimes in Palestine, and some of the world's most brutally repressive dictatorships, terrorists, and death squads. So, yeah, it turns out we might be the baddies. People have to hear it, though. People have to understand that in our name, our government has done some really horrible things, some horrible shit, going back decades, and still to some extent doing it today. And I know this is super uncomfortable to hear, okay? I don't like being the bad guy, but we're the bad guys. And I know many of you hate this, and many of you probably think that by pointing this out, we are being un-American. We are being un-American. But no, actually, look, this may sound naive and sort of like hokey and whatever, but no, you know what? I want the promise of America. I want the America that I was sold when I was little, all right? I want the shining city. I want the freedom. I want equality and justice. I want the America that was told to us as a child. The America that right-wingers pretend that we are, but we're not. The America that, by the way, Ilhan Omar represents. She came here as a refugee with nothing to make a better life for her and her family. She made it into Congress, and guess what? She fights for regular people, to help all people. That's the kind of America that I want to see. And maybe, of course, that's naive. Maybe it's naive for me to think it, but a better world is possible. And you know what? Even if it's not, I'm going to fight for it because I want that. I love that promise of America. And I think that we can do this. I think we can do better. And so I want to close out this segment with a clip here from the late Michael Brooks talking about Ilhan Omar and Saudi Arabia in a segment that was titled, "We Should Defend Ilhan Omar." So take a look.
Everybody needs to support her completely, fully, and unequivocally. There's no room for prevarication and bullshit. She is right on all of the merits of the policy questions. Incidentally, she has spoken out quite clearly on Saudi Arabia. That's a problematic formulation. If a Jewish congressperson criticized a dictatorship in another part of the world, I wouldn't immediately say, well, what's your position on the occupation? So that's a problem in and of itself. But that being said, I'll register that she has. And in fact, most people that are going to come into Congress and have an honest appraisal of a place like Saudi are going to be precisely the ones who are most likely to buck the consensus on a foreign policy built on Israel and Saudi Arabia in the Middle East, and ones that are going to question an ongoing commitment to both of these states with the abuses they commit. And of course, this has nothing to do with disrespecting or not caring about the safety and well-being of Israelis or Saudis for that matter. And again, look at that formulation. Nobody said in response to a tweet about Saudi Arabia, like, oh man, you're really feeding stereotypes about the Saudi monarchy. She's talking about policy issues. She's right on the merits, and the idea, the notion that she would not have a right to say these things because of who she is disgusting, racist, delusional in and of itself, and incredibly prejudiced and paranoid. So we need to have her back 100%.
If you enjoyed this video, please give us a like and share with your friends. You can subscribe and help out the channel by becoming a patron. It's patreon.com/Jeff Waldorf. Or you can become a channel member as well by hitting the join button below.